Marcus Henley pulled a drowning woman from Willowbrook Lake on a stormy evening. 4 days later, bailiffs arrived at his farm with eviction notices. He believed his act of kindness had somehow destroyed everything he'd worked for until he learned the incredible truth about the woman he'd rescued. Hi everyone, welcome to your channel name. Let's dive into this remarkable story. Marcus Henley had been farming the same 80 acres in Riverside County for 15 years, and every sunrise still felt like a gift. At 42, his weathered hands told the story of countless seasons planting corn in spring mud, housing soybeans under the blazing summer sun, and mending fences in winter frost that made his joints ache like an old machine running on borrowed time. The Henley family farm wasn't large by modern standards, but it was everything to Marcus. His grandfather, Thomas Henley, had started with just 20 acres back in 1952. Arriving from Tennessee with nothing but a worn-out truck, a few hand tools, and an unshakable belief that honest work could build something lasting. Thomas had chosen this particular plot because of its proximity to Willowbrook Lake, a crystal-clear body of water that stretched nearly 3 miles across, fed by underground springs that never ran dry, even during the worst droughts. Thomas had been a man of few words but deep wisdom. He taught Marcus's father, James, that farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was about stewarding the land for future generations. The soil remembers everything you do to it, Thomas used to say, running rich black earth through his fingers. Treat it right, and it'll take care of your children's children. James Henley had taken that lesson to heart, slowly expanding the farm over decades of careful saving and smart decisions. He'd added 40 acres in 1978, when the neighboring Pemberton family decided to sell, and another 20 acres in 1985, when drought forced the Mitchell farm into bankruptcy. Each expansion had been paid for in cash earned through years of 12-hour days and sacrificed vacations. James never borrowed money if he could help it. Having seen too many farmers lose everything when banks called in loans during tough times. When Marcus inherited the farm after his father's sudden heart attack in 2008, he'd made a solemn promise at the graveside overlooking Willowbrook Lake. He would keep the family legacy alive, no matter how hard the agriculture business became. And it had become incredibly, devastatingly hard. The agriculture industry that Marcus's grandfather and father had known was disappearing. Corporate mega-farms now dominated the market, using satellite-guided equipment and teams of agricultural scientists to maximize yields at scales that made family farms seem like hobby gardens. Companies like AgriCorp Industries and Midwest Grain Consortium could plant thousands of acres in a single day, while Marcus still spent weeks each spring carefully tending his modest 80 acres with equipment that was older than some of his neighbors' children. Equipment costs had skyrocketed beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. A new combine harvester essential for bringing in the corn and soybean crops that were Marcus's livelihood now cost more than his entire farm had been worth when his grandfather bought it. Marcus's harvester was a 1987 John Deere that he'd inherited from his father. Keeping it running required the mechanical skills of a master craftsman and the patience of a saint. He'd rebuilt the engine twice, welded the chassis more times than he could count, and had learned to fabricate replacement parts in his workshop when the originals were no longer manufactured. The financial pressures were relentless and growing worse each year. Seed costs had tripled in the past decade as agricultural companies developed genetically modified varieties that required annual purchases. No more saving seeds from one year's harvest to plant the next. Fertilizer prices fluctuated wildly, based on global petroleum markets, and a single tank of diesel fuel for his tractor now cost more than his grandfather had paid for his first car. Unpredictable weather patterns made each growing season feel like a high-stakes gamble. Climate change had brought extremes that old farming wisdom couldn't navigate. Springs arrived earlier, but with devastating late freezes that killed young plants. Summers brought either drought that turned the soil to concrete or torrential rains that flooded fields and rotted crops in the ground. Winters lasted longer and struck harder, freezing irrigation lines and damaging equipment left outside. Marcus had been operating on razor-thin margins for the past 3 years, borrowing against future harvests just to buy the seeds, fuel, and fertilizer needed for the current season. Each spring, he'd visit Riverside County Bank and sit across from loan officer Patricia Winters, explaining why this year would be different, why this harvest would finally turn things around. Patricia had been patient. She'd known the Henley family for 20 years, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes as the loan balances grew larger, while the farm's profitability remained stubbornly uncertain. The farm sat on some of the most beautiful land in Riverside County, positioned on the gentle hills that sloped down to Willowbrook Lake's northeastern shore. The location that had been such an advantage for his grandfather, providing reliable water access and fertile soil enriched by seasonal flooding, had become a double-edged sword in the modern era. The same pristine lakefront property that made farming possible also made the land incredibly valuable to developers who saw dollar signs in every acre. Marcus received offers to sell almost monthly. Real estate developers, vacation home builders, and corporate land speculators sent letters, made phone calls, and sometimes appeared at his door with contracts and briefcases full of promises. The amounts they offered were staggering enough money to set him up for life. To buy a comfortable house anywhere in the country, to never worry about bank loans or equipment failures again. Grayson Development Corporation had been the most persistent, offering nearly $3 million for the property. Their representative, a smooth-talking man named Charles Whitfield, had explained their vision. Willowbrook Estates luxury homes for discerning buyers who want to wake up to pristine lake views. This land is wasted on agriculture, Mr. Henley. You could be a millionaire by Christmas. But Marcus always turned them down, sometimes politely, sometimes less so. This wasn't just land to him, it was home. History and identity all rolled into 80 acres of memory-soaked soil. Every field held stories. The corner where his grandfather had built the first irrigation pump by hand. The oak tree where his father had taught him to identify different soil types by feel. The spot where he'd proposed to his wife Sarah before cancer took her away 5 years ago. His closest neighbor, old Pete Garrison, had been warning him for months that his stubborn attachment to the farm was dangerous. Pete owned the adjacent property, 40 acres of apple orchards that had been in his family almost as long as the Henley farm had been in Marcus's. Unlike Marcus, Pete was ready to sell. "Marcus, you're holding on to something that's slipping away anyway," Pete had said just last month, leaning against the fence that separated their properties. "These big companies, they always find a way to get what they want. You can fight them now and get a fair price, or you can fight them later and get whatever scraps they decide to throw you." Pete was 73 and tired. His children had moved to cities for careers in technology and finance, showing no interest in continuing the apple farming tradition. For Pete, selling to developers was retirement insurance. For Marcus, it felt like betraying everything his family had built. Pressure wasn't just financial, it was emotional and psychological. Marcus felt the weight of 3 generations of Henley men watching him, judging whether he had the strength and wisdom to preserve what they'd created. Some nights, lying in the farmhouse his grandfather had built with his own hands, Marcus wondered if he was being foolishly sentimental. Maybe the smart thing would be to take the money and start fresh somewhere else. Maybe fighting to save a dying way of life was just pride disguised as principle. But then morning would come, and Marcus would walk the property line that bordered Willowbrook Lake, checking the irrigation pumps that drew water for his crops. The view across the lake, especially at dawn when mist rose from the surface like gentle spirits, reminded him why his grandfather had chosen this spot. It wasn't just a farm, it was a piece of paradise that happened to grow some of the finest corn and soybeans in Riverside County. The lake itself was a constant source of both practical benefit and spiritual renewal. The water was so clean that it met all environmental standards for drinking water, fed by underground springs that connected to a vast aquifer system. Wildlife thrived around its shores, great blue herons that stood motionless in the shallows, families of deer that came to drink at dusk, and migrating waterfowl that stopped twice each year during their journeys. Between northern breeding grounds and southern wintering areas, Marcus had installed a sophisticated irrigation system that drew water from the lake through a series of pumps and underground pipes, allowing him to maintain optimal soil moisture even during dry spells. The system had cost him nearly $1,000 money borrowed against a future harvest that fortunately had been one of his better years. but it had proven invaluable during the drought of 2019, when neighboring farms watched their crops wither while Marcus's fields stayed green. The farmhouse itself told the story of 3 generations of gradual improvement and careful investment. Thomas Henley had built the original 2-bedroom structure in 1953. Using lumber from trees he'd cleared himself and stones hauled up from the lake shore. James had added a kitchen extension in 1965 when he married Marcus's mother, Elizabeth, and a second bathroom in 1980 when Marcus and his sister Jennifer were teenagers who couldn't seem to coordinate their morning routines. Marcus had made his own additions over the years: a wraparound porch where he and Sarah used to drink coffee and watch sunrise over the lake, a workshop where he maintained and repaired equipment, and a small greenhouse where Sarah had grown vegetables and flowers until illness made gardening impossible. Every nail, every board, every carefully chosen paint color represented, it's not just shelter, but the accumulated hopes and dreams of people who had believed in the power of hard work and patient investment. The workshop was Marcus's sanctuary, filled with tools that ranged from his grandfather's hand-forged hammers to modern diagnostic equipment for troubleshooting electronic systems on newer farm machinery. He'd taught himself welding, electrical work, hydraulics, and small engine repair skills that were essential when the nearest equipment dealer was 40 miles away and charged rates that could bankrupt a small operation. The walls were covered with parts, catalogs, repair manuals, and photographs of family members posed with various pieces of equipment over the decades. Marcus knew he was fighting an uphill battle that grew steeper each year. The bank had been patient, but their patience was wearing thin. One bad harvest, one major equipment failure, one unexpected expense, and he could lose everything that 3 generations had built. Environmental regulations were becoming more complex and expensive to comply with. Labor costs were rising as fewer people were willing to do the physically demanding work that farming required. Insurance premiums had doubled in 3 years as climate change made weather-related losses more common and severe. Still, Marcus got up every morning at 5 a.m. to put on work boots that were resoled twice and patched in multiple places, intended to the land that had shaped 3 generations of Henley men. He checked on his crops with the attention of a parent, monitoring sleeping children, noting subtle changes in color, growth patterns, and soil conditions that could signal problems or opportunities. He maintained equipment with the dedication of a craftsman who understood that a broken harvester during corn season could mean financial disaster. The corn and soybean rotation that his father had perfected provided both practical benefits and economic security. Corn depleted soil nitrogen, while soybeans, as legumes, actually added nitrogen back through their root systems. This natural cycle reduced fertilizer costs and maintained soil health better than continuous single-crop farming. Marcus had experimented with cover crops and organic practices, not because they were trendy, but because they made both environmental and economic sense for a small operation. He maintained detailed records of everything: soil test results, weather patterns, input costs, yield data, and profit margins for each field. The record-keeping was tedious, but it helped him make informed decisions about crop rotation, fertilizer application, and equipment purchases. The data also told a sobering story about the economics of small-scale agriculture in an era dominated by massive corporate operations. Despite all the challenges, Marcus felt a deep sense of purpose in continuing the farming tradition. There was something profoundly satisfying about planting seeds in spring and harvesting mature crops in fall, about working in partnership with natural cycles that had governed human agriculture for thousands of years. The connection to the land was spiritual as much as practical, a feeling that he was part of something larger and more permanent than himself. His neighbors understood this connection, even as many of them were making different choices about their own futures. The Riverside County farming community was tight-knit, bound together by shared challenges and mutual support. During harvest season, neighbors helped neighbors, sharing equipment and labor when mechanical breakdowns or weather emergencies threatened crops. The annual Riverside County Fair brought everyone together to celebrate agricultural traditions that were becoming increasingly rare in a rapidly changing world. Marcus had no idea that his dedication to helping others, the same impulse that had driven his family to be good neighbors for 3 generations, was about to collide with his fight to save the farm in ways he never could have imagined. Values his grandfather had instilled, the community spirit his father had modeled, and his own deep sense of responsibility for preserving. The family legacy were about to be tested in the most unexpected way possible. As autumn approached and harvest season loomed, Marcus was focused on practical concerns, monitoring weather forecasts, scheduling equipment maintenance, and coordinating with the grain elevator where he sold his crops. He had no way of knowing that a single evening by Willowbrook Lake would change everything, not just for him, but for people whose lives seemed to exist in a completely different world from his own. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when Marcus's routine nearly cost him everything he held dear. The day had begun like countless others, up at 5 a.m. to check on his crops before the morning dew evaporated. Coffee black and bitter from a pot that had seen better decades, and the familiar ritual of walking the property boundaries that connected him to 3 generations of Henley men who had made the same journey. The corn was nearly ready for harvest. The golden kernels plump with stored sunshine, and the stalks rustling with the dry whisper that told experienced farmers the time was almost right. Marcus had spent the morning hours moving through the rows, pulling back husks to examine individual ears, feeling the moisture content with fingers that had learned to judge readiness through years of practice. The crop looked good, better than he'd dared hope, after a spring that had brought late frosts, and a summer that had alternated between drought and deluge. His soybeans in the eastern fields were already showing the telltale yellowing that signaled approaching maturity. The pods were filling nicely, each one containing the protein-rich seeds that would help feed livestock across the Midwest. Marcus had planted a new variety this year, one that promised better yields but had cost nearly double the price of traditional seeds. It was a calculated gamble that seemed to be paying off, but he wouldn't know for certain until the combine harvester had made its final pass and the grain elevator had weighed and graded his crop. The morning inspection had revealed a few concerns that required immediate attention. A section of irrigation piping near the lake had developed a small leak, probably from ground settling after the heavy rains in August. Marcus had spent 2 hours digging carefully around the buried pipe, locating the crack, and applying a temporary patch that would hold until harvest was complete. Permanent repairs would have to wait. Every dollar was committed to harvest expenses and loan payments, due immediately after the grain sale. His 1987 John Deere combine was acting up again, developing an intermittent electrical problem that caused the grain monitoring system to shut down randomly. Marcus had spent the afternoon in his workshop, surrounded by wiring diagrams and diagnostic equipment, tracing circuits with the methodical patience of a detective following clues. The problem seemed to be in the main harness somewhere behind the cab, accessible only by removing panels and crawling into spaces that seemed designed for mechanics half his size. The combine represented both his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. Without it, he couldn't harvest his crops, and hiring a custom harvesting crew would eat up most of his profit margin. But the machine was 36 years old, and finding replacement parts often required creativity that bordered on engineering. Marcus had become expert at cross-referencing part numbers, finding compatible components from other equipment manufacturers, and fabricating solutions when commercial parts were no longer available. By 4 p.m., he'd identified the faulty connection and spliced a new wire, testing the system multiple times to ensure the repair would hold under field conditions. The combine would be ready for harvest, which weather forecasts suggested should begin by the weekend. Rare moment of optimism as he cleaned his tools and organized the workshop for the busy weeks ahead. The late afternoon routine was sacred time, a period Marcus had maintained even during his marriage to Sarah. He would walk the entire property boundary, checking fence lines, monitoring livestock, the dozen head of cattle he kept more for tradition than profit, and ending at the lakeshore where the irrigation pumps drew water for his crops. The walk served multiple purposes: exercise after hours of sedentary mechanical work, surveillance for problems that might not be visible from the cab of a tractor, and meditation that helped him process the day's challenges and plan for tomorrow's tasks. The fence line along the northern boundary needed attention. Several posts were showing rot at the base, The barbed wire was sagging in places where cattle had pushed against it during the summer heat. Marcus made mental notes about materials he'd need to purchase: pressure-treated posts, galvanized wire, and new insulators for the electric fence system that kept his small herd contained. The work would have to wait until after harvest. Everything waited until after harvest during these critical weeks. His cattle were a mixed bunch. Mostly Angus and Hereford crosses that he'd acquired over the years through a combination of purchases and trades with neighboring ranchers. They weren't particularly profitable. The costs of feed, veterinary care, and processing often exceeded the income from occasional sales, but they served important purposes on the farm. Their manure provided natural fertilizer for his fields. Their grazing helped maintain pasture areas that weren't suitable for row crops. Their presence connected Marcus to the diversified farming practices that had sustained his family for generations. The animals knew his routine and often gathered near the fence line when they saw him approaching. Marcus carried a pocketful of corn, kernel samples from his morning crop inspection, and the cattle would push against each other for position when he scattered the treats along the fence line. Old Bessie, a 15-year-old Angus cow who had been Sarah's favorite, always managed to claim her share despite competition from younger and more aggressive animals. Marcus had never intended to become so attached to livestock that were supposed to be agricultural assets rather than pets. But farming had taught him that the line between business and emotion was often blurrier than textbooks suggested. These animals depended on him completely, trusting him to provide food, water, shelter, and protection from predators and disease. In return, they offered the satisfaction that comes from caring for living creatures and the connection to agricultural traditions that predated corporate farming by thousands of years. The southern boundary adjoined Pete Garrison's apple orchard, and Marcus could see his elderly neighbor moving between the trees with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested every step but whose commitment to the work remained unshaken. Pete had been harvesting apples for nearly 5 decades, and his fruit was renowned throughout Riverside County for its quality and flavor. Unlike the mass-produced apples that dominated grocery stores, Pete's varieties were chosen for taste rather than shelf life, including heirloom types that commercial orchards had abandoned decades ago. Pete waved when he spotted Marcus walking the fence line, and the two men met at the property boundary that had separated their families' farms for more than 40 years. Their relationship had deepened during the years since Sarah's death, when Pete had made a habit of stopping by with fresh apple cider and conversation that helped Marcus through the loneliest evenings. "How's the corn looking?" Pete asked, his weathered face creased with genuine interest. The late afternoon routine was sacred time, a period Marcus had maintained even during his marriage to Sarah. He would walk the entire property boundary, checking fence lines, monitoring livestock, the dozen head of cattle he kept more for tradition than profit, and ending at the lakeshore where the irrigation pumps drew water for his crops. The walk served multiple purposes: exercise after hours of sedentary mechanical work, surveillance for problems that might not be visible from the cab of a tractor, and meditation that helped him process the day's challenges and plan for tomorrow's tasks. The fence line along the northern boundary needed attention. Several posts were showing rot at the base. The barbed wire was sagging in places where cattle had pushed against it during the summer heat. Marcus made mental notes about materials he'd need to purchase: pressure-treated posts, galvanized wire, and new insulators for the electric fence system that kept his small herd contained. The work would have to wait until after harvest. Everything waited until after harvest during these critical weeks. His cattle were a mixed bunch. Mostly Angus and Hereford crosses that he'd acquired over the years through a combination of purchases and trades with neighboring ranchers. They weren't particularly profitable. The costs of feed, veterinary care, and processing often exceeded the income from occasional sales, but they served important purposes on the farm. Their manure provided natural fertilizer for his fields. Their grazing helped maintain pasture areas that weren't suitable for row crops. Their presence connected Marcus to the diversified farming practices that had sustained his family for generations. The animals knew his routine and often gathered near the fence line when they saw him approaching. Marcus carried a pocket full of corn, kernel samples from his morning crop inspection, and the cattle would push against each other for position when he scattered the treats along the fence line. Old Bessie, a 15-year-old Angus cow who had been Sarah's favorite, always managed to claim her share despite competition from younger and more aggressive animals. Marcus had never intended to become so attached to livestock that were supposed to be agricultural assets rather than pets. But farming had taught him that the line between business and emotion was often blurrier than textbooks suggested. These animals depended on him completely, trusting him to provide food, water, shelter, and protection from predators and disease. In return, they offered the satisfaction that comes from caring for living creatures and the connection to agricultural traditions that predated corporate farming by thousands of years. The southern boundary adjoined Pete Garrison's apple orchard, and Marcus could see his elderly neighbor moving between the trees with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested every step but whose commitment to the work remained unshaken. Pete had been harvesting apples for nearly 5 decades, and his fruit was renowned throughout Riverside County for its quality and flavor. Unlike the mass-produced apples that dominated grocery stores, Pete's varieties were chosen for taste rather than shelf life, including heirloom types that commercial orchards had abandoned decades ago. Pete waved when he spotted Marcus walking the fence line, and the two men met at the property boundary that had separated their families' farms for more than 40 years. Their relationship had deepened during the years since Sarah's death, when Pete had made a habit of stopping by with fresh apple cider and conversation that helped Marcus through the loneliest evenings. "How's the corn looking?" Pete asked, his weathered face creased with genuine interest. Farmers were naturally curious about their neighbors' crops, understanding that agricultural success was often a community achievement rather than individual accomplishment. "Better than I expected after that crazy weather this summer," Marcus replied. "Should be ready to start cutting by Saturday if this dry spell holds. How about your apples?" Pete nodded toward trees heavy with fruit in various stages of ripeness. "It's the best crop I've had in years. The late frost missed us, and we got just enough rain without too much. Of course, it's probably my last crop." Statement hung in the air between them like a challenge neither man wanted to address directly. Pete had been talking about retirement and selling the orchard for months, but this was the first time he'd spoken with such finality about ending his farming career. "You sure about that?" Marcus asked quietly. "My kids aren't interested in continuing the orchard." "Can't say I blame them. There's not much money in small-scale fruit farming these days. It's better for them to build careers in fields that have actual futures." Pete's voice carried resignation rather than bitterness. "Grayson Development made me an offer last week. A fair price, and they're willing to let me stay in the house as a renter for as long as I want." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching evening air. If Pete sold to developers, the Henley farm would be surrounded on one side by luxury homes, whose owners would likely complain about agricultural odors, noise from machinery, and early morning fieldwork that disrupted their peaceful lakeside retreat. "What kind of development are they planning?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Same thing they want to do with your place, luxury homes for rich folks from the city who want weekend retreats by the lake." They showed me the plans. Pretty fancy, actually. Each house would have its own dock and boat launch. Pete studied Marcus's expression. "They asked a lot of questions about your farm, too. Whether you'd ever expressed interest in selling, what condition your equipment was in, how your crops had been performing." The news was troubling, but not surprising. Grayson Development had been circling the lakefront properties for years. This evening's inspection revealed nothing unusual. Water levels in the lake remained adequate despite below normal rainfall during August. The pumps were operating within normal parameters, and the intake screens showed only minor accumulations of algae and plant debris that could be cleared with routine maintenance. Marcus made notes in the logbook he kept in the pump house, documenting flow rates, pressure readings, and observations about water quality that might affect irrigation decisions. As daylight faded, Marcus walked back toward the farmhouse, mentally reviewing the tasks that would fill tomorrow's schedule. The combine needed one final systems check before harvest began. Several sections of irrigation line required inspection. for potential problems that could develop during the stress of harvest season. Weather forecasts needed careful monitoring for any changes that might affect the optimal timing for beginning fieldwork. The farmhouse welcomed him with the familiar comfort of 3 generations of memories embedded in every board and stone. Marcus prepared a simple dinner ground beef from one of his own steers, vegetables from Sarah's greenhouse, where he still maintained a small garden in her memory, and bread from the bakery in town that had been serving farming families since the 1940s. Evenings were the hardest time since Sarah's death 5 years earlier. The house felt too large and too quiet without her voice filling rooms with conversation about the day's events, plans for tomorrow's work, and dreams for the farm's future. Sarah had been Marcus's partner in every sense, sharing the physical labor of farming during busy seasons and providing the emotional support that sustained him through inevitable setbacks and disappointments. She had loved the lake almost as much as Marcus did, spending countless hours sketching the wildlife and photographing the subtle changes in light and season that marked the passage of agricultural time. Her greenhouse had been both practical workspace and artistic sanctuary, where she grew vegetables for their table and flowers that brightened every room of the farmhouse. Marcus had maintained the greenhouse as a memorial to her presence and a symbol of his commitment to continuing the life they had planned together. After dinner, Marcus settled into his father's old recliner with account books and agricultural journals, reviewing financial projections and studying articles about farming techniques that might improve his efficiency or profitability. The numbers were sobering but not desperate. This year's harvest would determine whether he could maintain current loan payments while setting aside enough capital for next year's operating expenses. The phone rang at 8:30, interrupting his calculations. Patricia Winters from Riverside County Bank apologized for calling during evening hours, but explained that she needed to discuss some concerns about his loan account. Several other farmers in the area had experienced crop failures or equipment problems that would prevent them from meeting their payment obligations, and the bank was reviewing all agricultural loans to assess potential risks. "I'm not saying there's an immediate problem with your account, Marcus," Patricia explained carefully, "but I need to know your harvest projections and your contingency plans if yields come in below expectations." Marcus provided the information she requested, emphasizing that his crops looked better than average and that he had no reason to expect problems with the harvest. Patricia seemed satisfied but reminded him that any significant delays or complications should be reported to the bank immediately. Agricultural loans were inherently risky, and banks were becoming increasingly cautious about extending credit to small-scale operations. After the call ended, Marcus sat in the darkening living room, staring out toward Willowbrook Lake, where lights from Pete Garrison's house reflected on the calm water. The conversation with Patricia had reinforced his awareness of how precarious his financial situation remained, despite years of careful management and hard work. One bad harvest, one major equipment failure, one unexpected expense could trigger a cascade of problems that might cost him everything his family had built. But giving up wasn't in Marcus Henley's nature. His grandfather had started with nothing and built a successful farm through depression, war, and economic upheavals that made current challenges seem manageable. His father had expanded the operation during periods when agricultural economics were far less favorable than today's conditions. Marcus owed it to their memory and to Sarah's faith in his abilities to continue fighting for the farm that represented 3 generations of dreams made real. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow evening would bring events that would test that commitment in ways he couldn't imagine, forcing him to choose between personal safety and helping someone whose life seemed to exist in a completely different world from his own. The routine that had sustained him through grief and financial pressure was about to be shattered by a single moment of moral choice that would change everything. Wednesday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that reminded Marcus why he loved farming, despite all its challenges. The air carried the scent of ripening grain and wood smoke from neighboring chimneys, while morning mist rose from Willowbrook Lake like ghostly fingers reaching toward a sky painted in shades of gold and pink. Weather forecasts promised 3 days of clear, dry conditions perfect for beginning the corn harvest. That would determine whether this year brought financial relief or deeper troubles. Marcus was up before dawn, moving through his morning routine with the efficiency of someone whose body operated on agricultural rhythms older than calendars. Coffee first, strong enough to strip paint and hot enough to warm hands that had grown stiff during the cool night, then the walk to check on his cattle, who greeted him with the patient expectation of creatures whose entire universe revolved around the reliability of human care. The corn was ready. Marcus could tell by the way the stalks rustled in the morning breeze, by the golden color of ears that had reached perfect maturity, and by the moisture content he could judge through fingers that had learned to read agricultural signs through decades of practice. Today would be devoted to final equipment, preparation, and one last comprehensive inspection of the fields to identify any potential problems before the harvest began in earnest. His 1987 John Deere combine started on the second attempt, the diesel engine coughing to life with the reluctant enthusiasm of machinery that had seen better decades but remained stubbornly functional. Marcus spent 2 hours running diagnostic checks on every system, the cutting header that would slice through corn stalks, the gathering chains that would feed ears into the machine, the shelling mechanism that would separate kernels from cobs, and the cleaning system that would remove chaff and debris from the grain. Everything looked good, but Marcus had learned never to trust first impressions when it came to complex machinery. He crawled underneath the combine to inspect hydraulic lines for leaks, checked belt tensions with the precision of a piano tuner, and tested backup systems that might save the harvest if primary components failed at critical moments. The machine represented both his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability without it. Couldn't harvest his crops, and hiring custom harvesters would consume most of his profit margin. The morning inspection revealed one minor concern: a bearing in the grain elevator that sounded slightly rough when the system was running. Marcus had replacement bearings in his parts inventory, but changing them would require several hours of careful work and perfect timing. He decided to monitor the situation closely and replace the bearing after the first day of harvest, when he would have a better sense of whether it could last through the season or needed immediate attention. By noon, Marcus was satisfied that his equipment was as ready as decades-old machinery could ever be. The combine was parked in the machine shed with fuel tanks topped off and all fluid levels checked. His grain trucka 1995 Ford, with a custom-built bed that could haul 20 tons of shelled corn, was positioned for easy loading and equipped with tarps to protect the harvest from unexpected weather. The afternoon was devoted to field preparation, tasks that would determine how efficiently the harvest could proceed. Marcus used his tractor to clear fence rows of volunteer trees and brush that could interfere with the combine's movement. He checked field access points to ensure gates were wide enough and approach angles were gradual enough to accommodate the large machinery. Most importantly, he walked every acre of the fields he planned to harvest, looking for obstacles that could damage equipment or create safety hazards. The fields looked magnificent. Row after row of mature corn stretched toward the horizon, each plant heavy with ears that represented months of investment in seeds, fertilizer, fuel, and labor. The plants stood 8 feet tall in most areas, their broad leaves now dried to the golden brown that signaled perfect harvest timing. Marcus estimated yields at close to 180 bushels per acre, above average for his soil conditions and significantly better than he dared hope after the challenging growing season. Walking through the corn was like moving through a cathedral built from living architecture. The rows created natural corridors that channeled wind into gentle whispers, while filtered sunlight painted shifting patterns on the ground between the stalks. Marcus had always found something deeply satisfying about being surrounded by crops he had planted, tended, and brought to maturity through months of careful attention to thousands of small details. But the fields also revealed potential problems that could complicate the harvest. Several areas showed signs of raccoon damage, where families of the intelligent animals had knocked down stalks to reach ripening ears. The damage wasn't extensive, but it would require careful navigation to avoid tangling the combine's header in broken stalks. A section near the eastern boundary showed evidence of deer feeding, where animals had trampled plants while reaching for ears they couldn't access from ground level. More concerning was a wet spot in the lowest section of the 40-acre field, where underground springs kept soil moisture levels higher than ideal for supporting heavy machinery. Marcus probed the area with a steel rod, checking soil firmness and trying to determine whether the combine could safely operate there without getting stuck. The decision would depend on weather conditions over the next few days. A period of sunshine might firm the soil enough for harvest, while any rainfall could make the area impassable. As afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from completing thorough preparation for important work. Tomorrow morning, he would begin the harvest that would determine his financial future for the coming year. The corn looked good, the equipment was ready, and weather forecasts promised favorable conditions. All the factors he could control were aligned for success. But farming had taught Marcus that the most critical factors were often beyond human control. Weather could change suddenly, turning perfect harvest conditions into nightmares of mud or delay. Equipment could fail without warning, despite the most careful maintenance and preparation. Market prices could fluctuate based on global events that had nothing to do with the quality of an individual farmer's crop. The evening routine proceeded as usual, a final check on the cattle, who were grazing contentedly in the pasture nearest the farmhouse, walk along the fence lines to ensure everything was secure for the night, and a stop at the pump house to verify that irrigation systems were functioning normally. The lake was calm and clear, reflecting the colors of sunset and the silhouettes of migrating waterfowl that used Willowbrook Lake as a stopover during their journey south. Marcus had always found peace in these evening walks, especially during stressful periods when the weight of responsibility for maintaining the family farm felt almost overwhelming. The connection to the land, the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, and the sense of participating in work that had sustained human civilization for thousands of years helped put daily challenges into perspective. Tonight, however, the usual sense of peaceful completion was disrupted by underlying tension about the harvest ahead and the financial pressures that made success so critically important. Marcus was acutely aware that this crop represented his best chance to catch up on loan payments, set aside capital for next year's operations, and demonstrate to the bank that the farm remained a viable business worthy of continued support. Dinner was simple. Leftover beef stew heated in a pot that had belonged to his mother, cornbread made from grain he'd grown and ground himself, and green beans from Sarah's greenhouse where he continued to maintain a small garden in her memory. The meal was filling and nutritious. But eating alone in the kitchen where 3 generations of Henley families had shared countless meals served as a daily reminder of how much his life had changed since Sarah's death. After dinner, Marcus settled into his father's recliner with a cup of coffee and the latest issue of Progressive Farmer magazine, reading articles about new harvesting techniques and equipment, innovations that might someday make small-scale operations more competitive with corporate agriculture. The magazine also contained market reports and economic analyses that painted a sobering picture of the challenges facing family farms across the Midwest. The phone rang at 8:45, interrupting his reading. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, and Marcus almost let the call go to voicemail before deciding to answer. Unexpected evening calls were often telemarketers or wrong numbers, but they could also be neighbors reporting problems with livestock or equipment that required immediate attention. "Marcus Henley," he said, settling back into his chair. "Mr. Henley, this is Detective Sarah Richardson with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I'm sorry to bother you this evening, but we're investigating reports of suspicious activity around Willowbrook Lake. Have you noticed anything unusual in your area recently?" The question surprised Marcus. Crime was rare in their rural community, where neighbors looked out for each other and strangers were immediately noticeable. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "We've had reports of trespassing on private property around the lake, possibly connected to illegal dumping or drug activity. I know your farm borders the lake for a significant distance. Have you seen any vehicles or people who seemed out of place?" Marcus thought carefully before responding. He spent significant time outdoors and was familiar with the normal patterns of activity around the lake: fishermen during appropriate seasons, occasional hikers using informal trails, and neighbors who had traditional access rights for specific purposes. Nothing unusual that I can think of. What kind of time frame are we talking about? The reports have come in over the past 2 weeks. Mostly people seeing vehicles parked in areas where there shouldn't be cars, lights moving around at night, that sort of thing. We're asking property owners to be extra vigilant and report anything that seems out of place. Detective Richardson provided her contact information and asked Marcus to call immediately if he observed anything suspicious. The conversation was brief and professional, but it left Marcus feeling unsettled about the security of his isolated property. The farm was nearly a mile from the nearest neighbor in some directions, and the lake shoreline provided numerous secluded areas where illegal activity could occur without detection. After hanging up, Marcus found himself listening more carefully to the normal evening sounds that filtered through the farmhouse walls. Owls calling from the oak trees near the barn, cattle moving restlessly in their pasture, and the gentle whisper of wind through corn that was ready for harvest. Everything sounded normal, but the detective's call had heightened his awareness of how vulnerable isolated rural properties could be. At 10:30, Marcus turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom he had shared with Sarah for 15 years of marriage. The room still contained reminders of her presence, photographs on the dresser, books she'd been reading on the nightstand, and the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd placed in dresser drawers. Marcus had never been able to bring himself to pack away these remnants of their life together, finding comfort in their presence even as they served as daily reminders of loss. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the hyper-awareness that follows conversations about potential security threats. Marcus found himself analyzing sounds that normally faded into background white noise. A vehicle passing on the distant county road, branches scraping against the farmhouse siding in the evening breeze, and the splash of a large fish jumping in Willowbrook Lake. Each sound triggered momentary alertness before being identified as normal and harmless. Thursday arrived with weather conditions that seemed designed specifically for corn harvest. Clear skies, low humidity, and gentle breezes that would help dry any remaining moisture from the grain. Marcus was up at 4:30, eager to begin the harvest that represented months of planning and preparation. The morning routine proceeded with unusual efficiency, as if his body walking through the corn was like moving through a cathedral built from living architecture. The rows created natural corridors that channeled wind into gentle whispers, while filtered sunlight painted shifting patterns on the ground between the stalks. Marcus had always found something deeply satisfying about being surrounded by crops he had planted, tended, and brought to maturity through months of careful attention to thousands of small details. But the fields also revealed potential problems that could complicate the harvest. Several areas showed signs of raccoon damage, where families of the intelligent animals had knocked down stalks to reach ripening ears. The damage wasn't extensive, but it would require careful navigation to avoid tangling the combine's header in broken stalks. A section near the eastern boundary showed evidence of deer feeding, where animals had trampled plants while reaching for ears they couldn't access from ground level. More concerning was a wet spot in the lowest section of the 40-acre field, where underground springs kept soil moisture levels higher than ideal for supporting heavy machinery. Marcus probed the area with a steel rod, checking soil firmness and trying to determine whether the combine could safely operate there without getting stuck. The decision would depend on weather conditions over the next few days. The work was physically demanding but deeply satisfying. Operating the combine required constant attention to dozens of variables: ground speed, header height, engine performance, grain quality, and field conditions that changed from one section to another. Marcus had to navigate around wet spots, adjust settings for variations in crop density, and monitor systems that could fail without warning if problems weren't detected early. As evening approached, Marcus was finishing the first of his 3 cornfields. The combine had performed flawlessly, the weather had remained perfect, and the crop was exceeding all expectations. He planned to work until full darkness, taking advantage of favorable conditions while they lasted. Agricultural wisdom emphasized the importance of making hay while the sun shone, nor in this case, harvesting corn while weather and equipment cooperated. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Marcus finally shut down the combine and climbed stiffly from the cab after 12 hours of nearly continuous operation. His body ached from sitting in the same position for extended periods, but his spirits were higher than they'd been in months. The harvest was off to an excellent start, and early projections suggested this crop might solve its most pressing financial problems. The evening walk took on special significance after such a successful day. Marcus felt deep gratitude for the combination of favorable weather, reliable equipment, and productive land that had made the day possible. The lake was calm and beautiful in the fading light, its surface broken only by the gentle ripples created by waterfowl settling in for the night. As he approached the pump house for his routine evening inspection, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. A vehicle was parked in the shadows near the lake shore, about 200 yards from his property line. The car wasn't visible from the road or from most vantage points on his farm, but it was clearly positioned to avoid detection while providing access to the lake. Marcus remembered Detective Richardson's call about suspicious activity around Willowbrook Lake. The vehicle could be innocent fishermen, sometimes parked in secluded spots to avoid crowds, and young couples occasionally used remote areas for privacy. But the timing and location seemed suspicious, especially given the recent reports of trespassing and possible illegal activity. He decided to investigate carefully, approaching through the cornfield that provided cover while allowing him to observe the situation without being seen. As he moved closer, Marcus could make out more details. The vehicle was an expensive-looking sedan, dark-colored and relatively new. No fishing equipment was visible. The car's position suggested the occupants were more interested in concealment than access to good fishing spots. Marcus crept closer, using the tall corn stalks for cover while trying to determine whether the situation warranted calling the sheriff's department. As he approached within 50 yards of the vehicle, he could see that someone was indeed inside the car, though details were difficult to make out in the failing light. Then he heard the splash. It wasn't the gentle sound of fish jumping or waterfowl landing. It was the distinctive splash of something large entering the water suddenly and violently. Marcus changed direction, moving toward the lake shore while trying to maintain concealment behind the vegetation that grew along the water's edge. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman was in the water, approximately 30 yards from shore, clearly struggling to stay afloat. She wasn't swimming, she was thrashing desperately, her movements becoming weaker with each passing second. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that she was in genuine distress. Fighting for her life against the dark waters of Willowbrook Lake, Marcus faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could retreat to his farmhouse and call 911, waiting for professional rescuers to arrive. The response time would be at least 15 minutes, probably longer given the remote location. By then, the woman would almost certainly drown, or he could act immediately, diving into the lake to attempt a rescue that might save her life, but would expose him to significant personal risk. The water was cold, the distance substantial, and Marcus hadn't attempted a swimming rescue since high school lifeguard training nearly 3 decades ago. If something went wrong, Willowbrook Lake could claim 2 victims instead of 1. The woman's head went under for several seconds before she managed to struggle back to the surface. Her movements now weak and uncoordinated. Marcus realized he was probably the only person who could reach her in time to prevent tragedy. Without conscious thought, Marcus dropped his cell phone on the shore and ran into Willowbrook Lake, diving forward as soon as the water was deep enough to submerge his body. The cold hit him like an electric shock, but he forced himself to swim hard, toward the spot where the woman was still visible. Knowing that every second of delay reduced her chances of survival, the rescue would test every ounce of his strength, courage, and determination. But Marcus Henley had never walked away from someone who needed help, and he wasn't going to start tonight, even though he had no way of knowing that this single act of compassion would soon threaten everything he'd spent his life building. The shock of cold water drove the breath from Marcus's lungs as he powered through the first few strokes toward the drowning woman. Willowbrook Lake, in late September, held the accumulated chill of cooling nights, and the temperature difference between the warm evening air and the lake's depths created a physiological crisis that could paralyze an unprepared swimmer. Marcus forced himself to maintain steady, powerful strokes, despite his body's instinctive reaction to the cold. Swimming in work clothes transformed a challenging rescue into a potentially fatal endeavor. His heavy denim jeans immediately absorbed water, becoming dead weight that dragged at his legs with every kick. His cotton work shirt billowed and clung, creating drag that fought against his forward progress. His leatherwork boots, waterlogged, within seconds, felt like concrete blocks attached to his feet. Marcus realized he should have taken time to remove at least his boots, but the woman's weakening struggles made every second crucial as he closed the distance. Marcus could see that the woman was young, probably in her 20s, with long dark hair that floated around her head like seaweed. She was wearing what appeared to be expensive clothing, a designer jacket, and dress that suggested she wasn't from the local farming community. Her movements had become increasingly uncoordinated, desperate thrashing giving way to the weak, ineffective motions that preceded complete exhaustion and submersion. 20 yards from her position, Marcus could hear her gasping attempts to call for help, each word interrupted by water entering her mouth as she struggled to keep her head above the surface. The sounds were heartbreaking raw, terror mixed with the growing realization that she was going to die unless something changed immediately. "Hold on," Marcus shouted, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over her own panic and the sound of water splashing around her head. "I'm coming." The woman's eyes found him across the water, and for a moment her struggles intensified as hope replaced despair. But the burst of energy was brief, and Marcus could see her strength failing rapidly. Hypothermia was setting in, robbing her muscles of coordination and power. Even if he reached her quickly, she might not have enough strength left to assist. In her own rescue, 15 yards away, Marcus began planning the rescue approach that would give both of them the best chance of survival. Swimming rescues were inherently dangerous because drowning victims often panicked and dragged their rescuers underwater in desperate attempts to stay afloat. Marcus remembered fragments of lifeguard training from high school: approach from behind when possible, maintain distance until the victim was calm enough to cooperate. Be prepared to dive underwater if the victim tried to climb on top of him, but textbook techniques assumed controlled conditions with proper equipment and backup support. This was a real emergency in challenging conditions, and the woman was clearly beyond the point where she could follow instructions or cooperate with rescue procedures. Marcus would have to improvise, adapting whatever he could remember to the specific circumstances of this situation. 10 yards away, Marcus could see the woman's face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, with delicate features that suggested a life of privilege and comfort, definitely not someone who belonged in the rough agricultural community around Willowbrook Lake. Her makeup was running in dark streams down her cheeks, and her jewelry caught the last rays of sunset as she fought to stay conscious. The woman's head went under again, staying down for several terrifying seconds before she managed to fight back to the surface. Her breathing was labored and irregular, interrupted by coughing spasms as water entered her lungs. Marcus realized she was probably minutes away from complete exhaustion and drowning. 5 yards away, Marcus made his final approach decision. The woman was too panicked and exhausted for a conventional rear approach, and he didn't have time for textbook procedures. Would have to grab her from the front, risking the possibility that she would pull him underwater in her desperation, to find something solid to hold on to. "I'm here," Marcus called out as he reached her. "Grab my shoulders, not my neck." The woman's response was pure instinct rather than rational thought. Her hands immediately went to Marcus's throat, her fingernails digging into his skin as she tried to climb on top of him for support. Marcus felt himself being pulled underwater as her weight and panic overwhelmed his ability to stay afloat while supporting both of them. Underwater, Marcus fought against the dual challenges of his own need for air and the woman's death grip around his neck. Her terror gave her superhuman strength, and her thrashing movements made it nearly impossible to control their position or return to the surface. Marcus realized he had perhaps 30 seconds to resolve the situation before they both drowned. Using techniques he half remembered from decades-old training, Marcus grabbed the woman's wrists and tried to break her grip on his throat. When that failed, he dove deeper, hoping to trigger her instinctive fear of going further underwater. The strategy worked. Partially, her grip loosened enough for Marcus to twist away from her grasp and surface for a desperate breath. Listen to me. Marcus gasped as soon as his head broke the surface. I can save you, but you have to let me do it my way. The woman was beyond rational thought, driven purely by the biological imperative to survive. She immediately reached for Marcus again, trying to use his body as a flotation device. This time, Marcus was ready. He grabbed her wrists before she could lock her arms around his neck, positioning himself to support her weight while maintaining enough freedom of movement to swim toward shore. Put your arms out straight, Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in emergency situations. Float on your back and let me pull you. Don't fight me. Whether from exhaustion or a momentary return of rational thought, the woman stopped struggling and allowed Marcus to position her for the rescue swim. Marcus hooked his left arm under her chin, supporting her head above water while using his right arm and legs to propel them both toward shore. The technique was far from perfect, but it was the best compromise between speed and safety given the circumstances. The swim to shore felt like it lasted hours, though Marcus knew it could only have been minutes. Every stroke was a battle against the weight of his waterlogged clothes, the woman's partially unconscious body, and his own growing exhaustion. The cold water sapped his strength steadily, and he could feel his muscles beginning to cramp from the combination of physical stress and hypothermia. Halfway to shore, the woman's body went completely limp, and Marcus feared she had lost consciousness, or worse. He managed to turn her face up toward the sky, checking for breathing while continuing to swim with increasingly desperate strokes. She was still alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin felt dangerously cold, even in the chilled lake water. Marcus's feet finally touched bottom when they were still 20 yards from shore, but the lake floor was soft mud that provided no solid footing. He half swam, half walked through the shallows, supporting the woman's unconscious weight, while fighting to maintain his own balance in the treacherous footing. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and cold, barely able to support his own weight, much less carry another person. The last few yards to shore required pure willpower. Marcus's vision was blurring from exertion and oxygen debt. His muscles were cramping, and the woman's limp body seemed to grow heavier with each step. But the thought of losing her, after coming so close to success, drove him forward through sheer determination. Marcus finally dragged the woman onto the rocky shore of Willowbrook Lake, both of them gasping and shivering violently in the evening air. The woman was unconscious, her lips blue with cold and her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Marcus realized that getting her out of the water was only the first step without immediate medical attention. She could still die from hypothermia or water in her lungs. His first aid training was limited but adequate for basic emergency response. Marcus checked the woman's pulse, which was rapid and weak, then tilted her head back to open her airway. She was breathing on her own, but water bubbled from her mouth with each exhalation, indicating that her lungs had taken on significant amounts of lake water. Marcus turned the woman onto her side in the recovery position, allowing gravity to help drain water from her lungs while keeping her airway open. She coughed violently, expelling lake water mixed with stomach contents, then drew a deeper breath that suggested her respiratory system was clearing. Her pulse remained weak, but steady, and some color was returning to her skin as her body began recovering from the near drowning. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but only managed incoherent sounds that were interrupted by more coughing. Marcus spoke to her in calm, reassuring tones, explaining that she was safe and that help was coming, though he hadn't yet called for medical assistance. "You're going to be okay," Marcus said, his own voice shaking from cold and adrenaline. "You're out of the water. Just focus on breathing." The woman's eyes found his face, and he could see recognition dawning, an understanding that this stranger had risked his own life to save hers. She tried to speak again, managing only a whispered thank you before another coughing spasm interrupted her words. Marcus realized he needed to get help immediately. The woman required professional medical attention for potential hypothermia, water in her lungs, and possible injuries sustained during her time in the lake. He also needed to determine what had caused her to end up in the water in the first place, whether this was an accident, a suicide attempt, or something more sinister. His cell phone was where he dropped it before diving into the lake, and Marcus was relieved to find it still functional, despite being splashed during the rescue. His hands were shaking so violently from cold and adrenaline that dialing 911 required several attempts, but he finally managed to connect with the emergency dispatcher. "This is Marcus Henley at 1247 Lakeshore Road," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just pulled a woman out of Willowbrook Lake. She's conscious but needs immediate medical attention for near drowning and hypothermia." The dispatcher was professional and efficient, gathering location information and dispatching both paramedics and sheriff's deputies to the scene. The estimated response time was 12 minutes, which seemed like an eternity when dealing with a medical emergency in a remote location. While waiting for help to arrive, Marcus focused on keeping the woman warm and conscious. He removed his soaked work shirt and used it to wipe lake water from her face and hair, then covered her with his jacket despite his own shivering. The evening air felt brutally cold against his wet skin, but the woman's need was more urgent than his own discomfort. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, partly to assess her mental state and partly to establish some human connection during the crisis. "Isabel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Isabel, Whitmore." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Whitmore, the same family name as the development company that had been pressuring him to sell his farm. If this woman was connected to Grayson Development's corporate interests, his rescue had just become infinitely more complicated. "Isabel Whitmore," Marcus repeated, trying to process the implications. "Are you related to the Whitmore family that owns property development companies?" Isabel's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded weakly. My father owns several companies, including Grayson Development." Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. He had just risked his life to save the daughter of the man who was trying to force him off his family's land. The irony was almost overwhelming. The very people who threatened his way of life had just been saved by the values that way of life had instilled in him. But there was no time to process the ethical complexities of the situation. Isabel was shivering uncontrollably. Her lips were still blue with cold, and her breathing remained labored. Personal feelings about her family's business practices were irrelevant when a human life hung in the balance. "Why were you in the lake, Isabel?" Marcus asked gently. "What happened?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears that mixed with the lake, water still dripping from her hair. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just ... I couldn't see any other way out." The words confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that this hadn't been an accident. Isabel Whitmore, daughter of one of the most powerful families in the region, had deliberately entered Willowbrook Lake with the intention of ending her life. The rescue had prevented a suicide, not an accidental drowning. "Isabel, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice firm but compassionate. "Whatever problems you're facing, they're not worth your life. You're young, you're alive, and there are always other solutions." "You don't understand," Isabel whispered. "You don't know what it's like to have everyone expecting you to be perfect, to live up to a family name that means everything to everyone except you." Marcus was beginning to understand that wealth and privilege hadn't protected Isabel from the same kinds of despair that affected people from all backgrounds. The pressure to maintain family expectations, the isolation that came with inherited responsibility, and the sense that her individual worth was secondary to her family's reputation had driven her to the breaking point. In the distance, Marcus could hear sirens approaching, the emergency vehicles responding to his 911 call. Within minutes, paramedics would take over Isabel's medical care, and sheriff's deputies would begin investigating the circumstances that had led to her near drowning. The immediate crisis was nearly over, but Marcus sensed that the larger implications were just beginning to unfold. As flashing lights appeared through the trees along the access road, Akasa realized that his spontaneous decision to dive into Willowbrook Lake had connected his life to forces he didn't understand and couldn't control. Saving Isabel Whitmore was the right thing to do, the only thing any decent person could do. But he had no way of knowing how that act of compassion would reverberate through both their lives in the days to come. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, taking over Isabel's care and beginning the process of stabilizing her condition for transport to the regional medical center. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area and began documenting the scene, treating the incident as a potential suicide attempt rather than an accidental drowning. As Isabel was loaded into the ambulance, she managed to catch Marcus's eye one final time. Her lips formed the words, "Thank you," before the paramedics closed the ambulance doors and began the urgent drive to the hospital. Marcus stood on the shore of Willowbrook Lake, watching the emergency vehicles disappear into the night, wondering how a simple act of human decency had suddenly made his own future so uncertain. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving Marcus alone on the shore of Willowbrook Lake, with nothing but the sound of gentle waves lapping against the rocks and the weight of what had just transpired. His body was still shaking from cold and adrenaline. His clothes hung heavy with lake water, and his mind struggled to process the implications of saving Isabel Whitmore's life. Detective Sarah Richardson arrived 30 minutes after the ambulance departed her patrol car's headlights, cutting through the darkness as she navigated the farm's access road. Marcus had used the time to change into dry clothes and start a fire in the farmhouse fireplace, but he remained deeply chilled from his extended time in the cold lake water. "Mr. Henley, I understand you're the one who pulled Ms. Whitmore from the lake," Detective Richardson said as she settled into the living room chair Marcus offered. "I need to get a complete statement about what you observed tonight." Marcus recounted the events chronologically, noticing the suspicious vehicle during his evening walk, observing the car's secretive positioning, hearing the splash, discovering Isabel struggling in the water, and making the decision to attempt the rescue. He described the rescue itself in clinical terms, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Though the detective's questions probed for details about Isabel's condition and statements, did Ms. Whitmore say anything that suggested this was intentional rather than accidental? Detective Richardson asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Marcus hesitated, remembering Isabel's whispered confession about not seeing any other way out. The woman had trusted him with information that could affect how authorities handled her case, and he felt torn between honesty and protecting her privacy during an obviously vulnerable time. "She was confused and hypothermic," Marcus said carefully, "but she did mention something about pressure from family expectations. It seemed like she was struggling with personal issues that went beyond just falling into the lake." Detective Richardson nodded, making notes. "The Whitmore family has been contacted. Richard Whitmore is flying back from a business trip in Chicago and should arrive at the hospital within a few hours. Isabel's condition has been stabilized, and doctors expect a full physical recovery." The detective's questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from the timeline of events to Marcus's knowledge of the Whitmore family's business interests. Marcus answered honestly, but volunteered nothing beyond what was specifically asked, uncertain about how much detail was appropriate given the sensitivity of the situation. "One final question, Mr. Henley," Detective Richardson said as she prepared to leave. "Are you aware that Grayson Development Corporation, owned by Richard Whitmore, has been trying to purchase your property?" The question confirmed Marcus's suspicion that tonight's events would be viewed through the lens of existing business relationships rather than simple human compassion. "Yes, I'm aware of their interest, but that had nothing to do with my decision to help his daughter." "I believe you," the detective said, closing her notepad. "But others might see connections where none exist. You might want to be prepared for questions about your motivations, especially if this incident receives media attention." After Detective Richardson left, Marcus sat alone in his living room, staring into the fire and trying to make sense of how a routine evening had transformed into something that could affect the rest of his life. He'd saved a woman from drowning, an act that should have been unambiguously positive, but the victim's identity complicated everything in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Sleep was impossible. Marcus spent the night alternating between reliving the rescue and worrying about potential consequences he couldn't predict or control. By dawn, he'd consumed an entire pot of coffee and filled several pages with notes about the incident, trying to organize his thoughts for whatever came next. Friday morning brought a return to the routine of harvest, though Marcus found concentration difficult. The corn wasn't going to harvest itself, and favorable weather wouldn't last indefinitely. He forced himself to focus on the immediate tasks of operating machinery and monitoring crop quality using physical work as a distraction from his churning thoughts about the previous evening. The combine ran smoothly through the morning hours, steadily reducing the acres of standing corn while filling truckloads of grain destined for the elevator in town. Marcus had hoped that familiar work would provide normalcy, but he found himself repeatedly glancing toward the lake shore where the rescue had occurred, unable to shake the memory of Isabel's terrified eyes as she fought for her life in the dark water. At 11:30 a.m., Marcus's cell phone rang with a call from an unknown number. He considered letting it go to voicemail. Harvest demanded full attention, but something made him answer. "Mr. Henley, this is Patricia Chen, Richard Whitmore's personal assistant. Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you about last night's incident involving his daughter. Would you be available to meet with him this afternoon?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. Face-to-face meeting with Richard Whitmore could only complicate an already complex situation. "I'm in the middle of harvest. Can this wait until next week?" "Mr. Whitmore is very eager to speak with you as soon as possible. He's prepared to compensate you for your time, and he's willing to meet at your convenience and in your field if necessary." The mention of compensation made Marcus uncomfortable. He hadn't saved Isabel's life for money, and accepting payment felt like it would taint the purity of his motivations. "Chen, I don't need compensation. I did what anyone would do in that situation. Nevertheless, Mr. Whitmore insists on meeting with you personally. He's waiting at Riverside County Hospital, but he can drive to your farm whenever you're available." Marcus realized that avoiding the meeting would probably create more problems than agreeing to it. Richard Whitmore was accustomed to getting what he wanted when refusing to meet would likely be interpreted as some kind of power play rather than simple desire to avoid complications. "Tell Mr. Whitmore he can come to my farm at 2 p.m., Marcus said. "I'll be working in the field behind my house, the one closest to the lake." "Thank you, Mr. Henley. Mr. Whitmore appreciates your willingness to meet on short notice." Marcus spent the next 2 hours trying to focus on harvest work while mentally preparing for a conversation that could determine his farm's future. Richard Whitmore was reportedly a skilled negotiator who had built his fortune by identifying what people wanted most and using that knowledge to structure deals that served his interests. Marcus needed to be careful not to provide leverage that could be used against him later. At exactly 2 p.m., a black Mercedes sedan appeared on the farm's access road. Navigating carefully around the grain truck Marcus had parked near the machine shed. The car was immaculate and expensive, completely out of place in the agricultural setting, but clearly chosen to make an impression about the driver's wealth and status. Richard Whitmore emerged from the Mercedes wearing a business suit. That probably cost more than Marcus's monthly income. He was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room he entered. Despite the formal attire, he walked directly into the cornfield without hesitation, showing no concern for mud or crop debris that might soil his expensive shoes. "Mr. Henley," Richard Whitmore said, extending his hand as he approached the combine. "I can't adequately express my gratitude for what you did last night. You saved my daughter's life." Marcus shut down the combine and climbed from the cab, accepting the handshake while studying Whitmore's expression for clues about his intentions. "How is Isabel doing?" "Physically, she's recovering well. The doctors say there shouldn't be any lasting effects from the hypothermia or water in her lungs." Emotionally, Whitmore paused, his confident facade cracking slightly. "She's been struggling with depression for several months. We've been trying to get her professional help, but she's resisted our efforts." The admission of family problems seemed genuine, and Marcus felt some of his defensive tension ease. Whatever else Richard Whitmore might be, he was clearly a father who loved his daughter and was grateful to the man who had saved her life. "I'm glad she's going to be okay," Marcus said. "Is she agreed to accept help now?" "Yes, actually. Something about last night changed her perspective. She told me this morning that she wants to start therapy and maybe spend some time in a residential treatment program. She said you talked to her about finding reasons to live, and that made an impression." Whitmore looked around the farm, his businessman's eyes taking in the equipment, fields, and general condition of the operation. Marcus wondered if he was evaluating the property's development potential even during a conversation about his daughter's suicide. "Mr. Henley, I want to find a way to thank you for what you did. Isabel told me you risked your own life to save hers, and that you stayed with her until paramedics arrived. That kind of selfless action deserves recognition. Marcus shifted, uncomfortably. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need recognition. I did what anyone would have done in that situation. No, you did what very few people would have done. Most people would have called 911 and waited for professionals to handle the rescue. You immediately put yourself at risk to help a complete stranger. Whitmore paused, studying Marcus's expression. I've spent my career evaluating people's character, and what you did last night tells me everything I need to know about yours. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Whitmore? I know that Grayson Development has been trying to purchase your property. Also know that you've refused our offers because this farm has been in your family for generations. I want you to know that those purchase attempts are permanently withdrawn. This property will never again receive development offers from any company I control. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The constant pressure to sell had been one of his greatest sources of stress, and knowing that it was permanently resolved, eliminated a major threat to his peace of mind. But I want to do more than just stop pressuring you to sell, Whitmore continued. I've learned that you've been struggling financially, working with old equipment and tight margins. I'd like to establish a trust fund that would provide annual payments to help you maintain this farm in perpetuity. The offer was more generous than Marcus had ever imagined possible. But it also felt like charity that might come with strings attached. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not comfortable accepting money. It would change the nature of what happened last night. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was a business partnership that benefited both of us? Whitmore reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. I've been researching sustainable agriculture and environmental conservation as potential business ventures. Your farm could serve as a model for environmentally responsible farming practices that preserve water quality while maintaining agricultural productivity. Marcus examined the documents which outlined a partnership between Whitmore Industries and the Henley farm that would provide substantial annual funding in exchange for implementing and demonstrating sustainable farming techniques. The arrangement would allow Marcus to upgrade his equipment, expand his conservation practices, and serve as a showcase for agricultural methods that protected environmental resources. This partnership would make your farm a research and demonstration site for sustainable agriculture, Whitmore explained. You'd maintain complete ownership and operational control. But you'd receive funding to implement conservation practices and host educational programs for other farmers. The proposal was intriguing and seemed to align with Marcus's own values. About environmental stewardship, financial support would eliminate his immediate economic pressures while allowing him to pursue farming methods that protected the lake and soil resources for future generations. There's one more element to this proposal, Whitmore said. I'd like Isabel to be involved in managing the environmental education programs. She has a degree in environmental science that she's never used and working on meaningful conservation. Projects might give her the sense of purpose she's been lacking. Marcus realized that Whitmore was proposing a solution that would benefit everyone involved: financial security for the farm, environmental benefits for the community, meaningful work for Isabel, and a successful business venture for Whitmore Industries. The arrangement would transform last night's rescue from a simple act of compassion into the foundation for a partnership that could last for decades. I'd need time to review this with my attorney and accountant, Marcus said. And I'd want to meet with Isabel to make sure she's genuinely interested in this work, rather than just doing what her father thinks would be good for her, of course. Take all the time you need. Isabel will be in treatment for at least a month. But she's already expressed interest in finding work that contributes to environmental protection, rather than just generating profits. Whitmore extended his hand again. Mr. Henley, regardless of whether you accept this partnership proposal, I want you to know that what you did last night has changed my family's life. Isabel has a future because of your courage and compassion. As the black Mercedes disappeared down the farm's access road, Marcus stood in his cornfield trying to process how dramatically his circumstances had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, he'd been a struggling farmer facing financial pressure and development threats. Today, he was being offered a partnership that could secure his farm's future while advancing environmental conservation goals he'd always supported. The harvest continued over the next 3 days, yielding results that exceeded Marcus's most optimistic projections. The partnership with Whitmore Industries would make the financial success less critical for his immediate survival. His decision to maintain the farming operation despite economic challenges. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a handwritten letter from Isabel, who was participating in a residential treatment program in Colorado. She thanked him again for saving her life and expressed enthusiasm about the environmental education partnership. She wrote about finding purpose in work that could help protect natural resources like Willowbrook Lake, and about her gratitude for the second chance that Marcus's courage had given her. "You told me that night that there are always other solutions," Isabel wrote. "You were right, but I needed someone to show me that solutions sometimes come from the most unexpected places. Saving my life was just the beginning. You also saved my family and gave me a reason to want to build something meaningful with the future you made possible." 3 months later, Marcus stood on the shore of Willowbrook Lake watching construction. Crews install educational facilities for the Henley Whitmore Conservation Partnership. The buildings were designed to blend with the natural landscape, while providing classroom and laboratory space for agricultural and environmental education programs. Isabel had returned from treatment and was working closely with environmental engineers to design water quality monitoring systems that would demonstrate the connection between farming practices and lake ecosystem health. Her expertise in environmental science, combined with her personal connection to the lake where she'd nearly died, brought passion and authenticity to the educational programs. The partnership had attracted attention from agricultural colleges, environmental organizations, and government agencies interested in supporting sustainable farming initiatives. Grant funding was expanding the program's scope to include research projects and demonstration plots that would benefit farmers throughout the region. Marcus's equipment had been upgraded with precision agriculture technology that optimized fertilizer application and reduced environmental impact while improving crop yields. The new machinery made farming more efficient and less physically demanding, extending his ability to continue operating the farm for years to come. On the anniversary of Isabel's rescue, Marcus and the Whitmore family gathered at the lakeshore for a dedication ceremony that formally established the conservation partnership. Isabel, healthy and radiant with purpose, spoke about the importance of protecting natural resources and supporting farming families who served as stewards of the land. "A year ago, I thought my life had no meaning," Isabel told the assembled crowd of farmers, students, and environmental advocates. "Today I understand that meaning comes from connections to the land, to each other, and to work that makes the world better for future generations. This partnership exists because one man chose compassion over convenience, and that choice created ripples that continue to expand." Richard Whitmore announced that Grayson Development Corporation was transitioning from luxury residential projects to conservation-focused land management, with the Henley Farm serving as the model for developments that preserved agricultural and environmental resources rather than destroying them. Marcus reflected on how a single moment of moral choice had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of people he'd never met. The farm that had been threatened by development pressure was now protected in perpetuity. The lake that had nearly claimed Isabel's life was now the centerpiece of conservation efforts that would protect water quality for generations. The young woman who had lost hope had found purpose in work that honored the natural resources that had brought them together. A sunset painted Willowbrook Lake in shades of gold and crimson. Marcus understood that the most important moment of his life had indeed occurred in the time it took to choose between walking away and diving in. But the consequences of that choice continued to unfold in ways that none of them could have predicted, proving that acts of genuine compassion create possibilities that extend far beyond the original moment of courage. The rescue had saved more than Isabel's life. It had saved Marcus's farm, protected environmental resources, created meaningful work for dozens of people, demonstrated that the values of rural communities could adapt to meet contemporary challenges without sacrificing their essential character. Standing on the shore where it all began, Marcus realized that the greatest harvest wasn't measured in bushels of corn or dollars in the bank, but in the knowledge that choosing to help someone in need had planted seeds that would continue growing long after he was gone, nourishing the land and the people who would call it home for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.